All right, thank you. Uh, so I'm going to be presenting on our grassroots salmon recovery project. And as mentioned, this is a joint project between the Makah Tribe and the Olympic National Park. Next slide, please. Sockeye salmon were once an abundant species in Lake Ozette and played a critical role for the ecosystem of transporting marine-derived nutrients into the watershed. The fish were also an important seasonal food item for the Makah Tribe. The population crashed in the 1970s, and despite efforts of hatchery supplementation, the population has not recovered. In fact, among listed salmon populations, Lake Ozette sockeye are one of the few considered to be in crisis. This outcome is quite surprising, given that the majority of the freshwater habitat used by the Lake Ozette sockeye is within the Olympic National Park. So it is now evident that more effort is needed to help the population recover than just trying hatchery supplementation. Next slide, please. We are fortunate that a very thorough limiting factors analysis was completed in 2009. And in this, the authors, which was led by Michael Haggerty, evaluated within the different life stages of the salmon what factors were limiting their recovery. And so I'm going to focus here on some of the spawning life stages. You can see the big red arrows within this figure are identifying the limiting factors with the highest impact on the recovery of the population. And some of these issues are things that we cannot do anything about, like general marine survival. That's going to fluctuate annually based on ocean conditions and ocean productivity, and we can't do anything with that. Other aspects like predation, we probably just lack the political will to do anything to reduce predator populations, which really leaves us with just the spawning habitat as a factor that we can do something about and to try to improve. So we really must start efforts to improve the spawning habitat for Lake Ozette sockeye salmon. The next slide, please. Sockeye salmon spawn both in the tributaries of Lake Ozette and within the lake. Spawning occurs at Umbrella Creek, Big River, and Crooked Creek. Umbrella Creek is where the Makah Tribe runs a hatchery program to supplement the population. Spawning within the lake currently only occurs on the south end of the lake, and it's hard to see within the figure, but towards the south end of the lake, there's Allen's Beach on the west and Olsen's Beach in the east, and I think that they're kind of highlighted in red. Historically, most of the production of sockeye salmon within the lake was from the lake spawning population, a portion of the population. And as such, this portion of the population is very critical for the recovery of the sockeye. Next slide, please. In 2021, we started looking into what can we do to improve this habitat. And so I went out with a team that included the tribe's historical preservation officer and an archaeologist for the national park, a habitat biologist from the Makah Tribe, Stephanie Martin, and with interns from Makah Fisheries Management. And what we observed was that the beachside areas of the spawning area, the lower beach and the mid beach has been overgrown with sweet gale and sedges and into these really dense mats of growth. And unfortunately, what happens with that vegetation is once it is established, it starts a positive feedback loop that its establishment allows the roots to help retain silts and fine sediments that are negative for spawning quality. And the wave action during the next winter gets broken up by the plant structure. And so that reduces the energy that's hitting the beach, so that reduces how much of the fine silts and fine sediments that are in the adjacent sediment. and as a result, more vegetation can establish. And so we're currently in a system that's very different than what it was historically, when it's thought that these beaches were mostly bare of vegetation. And it is thought that there was a change in the system due to past logging practices that allowed a large input of silt and fine sediment into the lake that deposited around it and allowed the establishment of vegetation and this positive feedback loop. So our interest is in breaking this positive feedback loop by removing vegetation. We had some more hope for success of this project by evaluating a pilot project that was conducted by the USGS, the Olympic National Park, and the Makah Tribe. During this project, they removed vegetation from about 10 meters of the beach, so not a very large study area. And they didn't, in all cases, remove the vegetation all the way down through its roots. So a lot of cases, they just clipped down to the beach level. And despite having a small area of evaluation and having some of the plants still have their roots established, we saw visually a coarsening of the gravel within that area compared to the adjacent areas with vegetation. Next slide, please. During the site visit, I mentioned that we worked with our tribal historic preservation officer, as well as Dave Conca, who's an Olympic National Park archaeologist. And one of the things we noted was that the sites all around Lake Ozette were utilized in the past by Aboriginal groups, including the Makah Tribe. And this, if we were to try to treat these sites and remove the vegetation with heavy machinery, damage historical artifacts, and that method of work would not be suitable for this project area. Next slide. So we started a project in 2002 to start addressing this this effort to remove the vegetation, and we had some limitations, right? We could not work with heavy machinery to remove the vegetation. Also, we didn't have any money. So what we did is we set up a project of recruiting volunteers to help us with the removal. And this is definitely a Herculean effort. This is removing this much vegetation from the beach. It's a lot of physical work, but we're lucky that there are a lot of people within our community and in the surrounding areas that are committed to helping their habitat or their ecosystem be improved. And so our goal was to recruit volunteers annually and to work incrementally each year from north to south along the spawning beach, with the goal of trying to clear all of the vegetation within a 10-year period. This work has been coordinated by myself and Pat Crane of the Olympic National Park, but we were also assisted by a committee of individuals, including Shannon Murphy of Makah Wildlife, Stephanie Martin of Makah Fisheries, Rebecca Monette of the Makah Culture and Research Center, and next slide, please. And Roy Morris, who's a volunteer within the community. And I'm highlighting his picture here just because of how important it is to engage with people that are very interested and passionate in the work. And when you engage with those types of people like Roy, they can engage more people and get more people involved. And I should note that this project is named the Grassroots Salmon Recovery Project, and that's got a double meaning in the name for grassroots. First, it's recognizing that this is a vegetation removal project, and really we have to remove these plants all the way down through their roots for the effort to be effective. And second, because this is a volunteer effort of getting people to work together and to recruit people to have enough bodies to get the work done, we are really counting on the word of mouth spreading from person to person to recruit more people, just kind of a grassroots communication to keep this effort going. Next slide, please. The other logistical challenge you might be kind of seeing in some of these pictures is we have a lot of boats in these photos. And that's because the boat launch, the closest road access is on the north end of the lake, and our project area is on the southeast side of the lake. So in addition to recruiting volunteers, we have to recruit the use of boats. Currently, we have made use of boats from the Makah Tribe and from our marine mammal program and our habitat program, as well as boats from the Olympic National Park, and as well as volunteers boats like Will Jasper and Roy Morris allowed us to use their boats. And in the future, we're kind of capacity limited on how many people we can transport to do the work, and hopefully we can recruit more people to bring their boats out to help us out in future years. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, 2022 was our first year. The beach looked a lot like what you see in the upper right. You could see in the upper right, we've already actually removed a lot of the sweet gale that was along the beach, and right now it's just a lot of the sedges that's there, and they made a dense mat of roots that spread over the whole beachfront. And you can see in the bottom left, our volunteers were able to knock out 35 meters of that beachfront over a 2-day period. We had a team of about 27 volunteers, and between them, they contributed about 39 days of work effort. And you can see the bare ground that's left after their diligent work within that first year. Next slide, please. Last year was our second year of effort. We had 50 volunteers over 3 days of coordinated effort, resulting in about 81 work days of volunteer effort. We had volunteers and staff contributed from Makah Fisheries Summer Internship Program, Makah Fisheries Management staff, the Olympic National Park, the Olympic National Park's Northwest Youth Corps, the United States Coast Guard, the Quileute Tribe, Peninsula College, and citizens from the communities of Neah Bay, Port Angeles, CQ, and as far away as Edmonds, Washington. And each year, as we do this project, we learn how to get more efficient, and we're able to then clear more of the area. And so you can see in the top photo and the left photo, we are working a lot with mattocks now, which allow us to dig in and to, you guys, I just saw a note come up of people having troubles hearing audio. Am I not speaking loudly enough?
Nope, you're good.
Okay.
Still hear you, John.
Okay, that sounds good. So that is allowing us to really dig in and get these roots out to allow the wave action to clear the area. Next slide, please. So this is a photo or a stitching of 3 photos from Olsen's beach on the north end of the beach in this last summer in 2023. And you can see we have people working on the beach when this photo was taken. And you go to the next slide. And you can see this was the same section of beach. And you can see how much vegetation is removed. That on the right side of the photo, on the left side, you've got that dense growth of sweet gale makes bushes about 3 feet high. And underneath it is a real thick mat of sedges that grow. And all of that is removed, and that's allowing wave action to get into the beachfront and wash through the rocks. And this will remove the fine sediments and the silt from there with the natural action there. And it will allow oxygen rich water and, water rich and dissolved oxygen to saturate through into the gravel, which makes it ideal for spawning. Next slide, please. The other benefits that we have on this project is that the recovery plan for the for the Lake Ozette sockeye salmon called for recruiting of volunteers to get people invested in the recovery of the species. And this project is doing a great job of that. We've recruited, as I said, a large number of volunteers over the past 2 years. And all of these people now have a connection with what is happening up the lake and a connection with feeling that they are making a contribution to the recovery of the species. It's also been a great learning opportunity for our interns at Makah Fisheries Management, as well as the Youth Corps participants for the Olympic National Park, to learn the value of hard work, of putting their time in and putting their effort in, and how that can be beneficial to a species, or how that type of effort can address any problem you identify, that you can team up together and address it. Next page, please. So some conclusions. So far, we're in the infancy of this project. We've only completed 2 years of work, but we're already have some great results coming out. And one of the most important is that our survey teams at Makah Fishery Management have actually observed a spawning pair of sockeye salmon within the treatment area this past year. And we've got a lot more beach to cover, and the effect size as we open up more beach is going to allow the wave action to clear out even more. And so that's probably going to improve that habitat each year as the winter waves are washing through. The other thing is that this project has been a great model of the value of utilizing volunteers for the recovery of a listed species. It's probably no exaggeration to say there's thousands of people out there that is this wealth of opportunity we have, that we can tap into this resource to address problems. We don't need the big grant for every project. When we write up a recovery plan or you see a limiting factor analysis and you see something with habitat and say, oh man, there's just too much work to be done to do that. We can't do it without getting a grant. And I would argue that I think we can. We just have to put in the effort to tap into the right people, and you let those people work together and we can achieve great things. So with that, I'd like to encourage any of you that are on this conference or this call, whatever it is, and if you're interested to volunteer, or if you know people that would be interested, to have them reach out. I have my email here on the page, and so please come out and help us save the Lake Ozette sockeye salmon. With that, I will open it up to questions.
Thank you. Thank you. You have several questions in the chat. I'll start with the one earlier. Someone asked, might it be easier to do controlled burns along shore?
That's outside of my competency. I'm a marine mammal biologist, and I'm out there working on the lake doing a habitat project. So I'm already outside of my competency area, but it's not a very hard competency to go through and dig out vegetation. The challenge would be getting permits and having the right people in place to make sure that the burn wouldn't expand. I think one of the biggest challenges of that is that this vegetation gets covered in water in the winter. The lake rises, and all this area that is vegetation that you can see in the photos is the area where spawning occurs. So if you think about, we can't do that work in that area until we get really into the dry season, which would probably make us at much greater risk to doing a burn and have it become unmanageable.
Okay. All right, we have a two-part question. With the clearing of so much vegetation and disturbance, has there been any issues with other invasive plant species establishing? And are there any plans to do any native replanting in the area to provide competition?
So the goal is actually to remove all plants. So all the plants that are there that we're running into are essentially all native that I'm aware of. So this is kind of an odd project of where we think of invasive species as causing a problem. And this isn't really an invasive species. It's just that the native species are invading an area that they weren't historically able to thrive. And I think that part of our plan is that each year we're going back and removing vegetation from the areas we've already cleared. And I think that this will help us eliminate any invasive species that are coming into the cleared areas. And hopefully, in the long term, the wave action and during the winter time and the currents, as well as the spawning salmon, will remove the fine sediments and silt that have established in the sediment, so that new plants cannot establish, and it restores back to the state of being prime spawning habitat.
Okay, thanks. Have the logged watersheds recovered to the point that fine sediment transport is no longer occurring, and allowing wave action and gravel beaches to maintain in a restored condition?
The limiting factor analysis does a really good job of evaluating how much of the watershed, the upper watershed above Lake Ozette, is being logged and how many roads there are. And there are a substantial number of forest roads in those areas, which is probably, one of the greater point sources of sediment to come into watersheds, as well as, there is active logging still. So I don't know that they've recovered. Fine sediment transport is no longer occurring. The hope is just that we're breaking that positive feedback loop and resetting the cycle, and hopefully being on this early, getting it back to that early cereal stage of before the establishment, by getting it to clean gravel. Hopefully the natural system will help it maintain clean. But I guess my expectation is, if we weren't maintaining this long term, if there weren't efforts to continue to go out there, that in time it would regrow with vegetation, because there is sediment and silts in the lake that would resettle in there.
Okay. I don't know if you're seeing these questions, John. We have one that says, we've had to stop using Marshmaster because it dug up soil at one of our amphibian sites. I wonder if a Marshmaster could be set low enough to rip through this stuff.
I have no idea what a Marshmaster is, so I can't answer that.
Yeah, I don't know if that person wants to jump on and share, but
Marshmaster is made to go in wet areas, and it's a mower that you can drag and set the bed at different heights. So we use it in wetlands and other flooded areas for like reed canary grass control. It's made specifically for like flooded and wet areas, and just in our situation, we set it low because we needed the vegetation to be cut low, but it caused so much soil disturbance we had to stop. But in your scenario, if you could, the issue would be getting it over to the site, because it's a pretty big machine, but then you can drive it right along shorelines.
Yeah, permits are always difficult with the park. I'll just say that real broadly on this thing of the parks. I'm keeping it as simple as possible, right? The KISS theory on it. And I'll probably keep going with that, because what we're doing is working. And I'm happy with that. And so right now, the plan would just to keep going with what has worked. And I think it's a neat model, and I want to just keep going with that model.
Okay, John. Someone asked, do you need help tracking the human dimensions impact of this project? I'd be glad to help. It says unknown user, so I don't know who said that.
It doesn't say who it is. I am not interested in keeping track of the human dimensions side of it. My interest is just getting the job done. But if somebody wanted to come in and evaluate that stuff, if they want to do their master's looking at the human dimensions or whatever, we are collecting, the data on who the people are that are coming out and the number of hours that people are out. And if they wanted to play with that information and reach out to people further, that could be a cool project. But for me, my interest is just getting the job done so we can recover the salmon.
Okay, thank you. With grassroots efforts, how are you moving past issues of permitting from tribes or state to invite volunteers to work on specific plots of land? Or are you helping to steward on privately owned lands?
So right now the work is all in the national park. So the permitting issues from tribes, one of the challenges that we have for the Makah Tribe is that we have to, an interpretation of our drug-free workplace is that we have to do drug testing of our volunteers. And so that would require our volunteers to come to Neah Bay and be drug tested to then go out to the project site. And so if they're taking a prescription medicine, that could flag them, or if they're smoking marijuana, which is legal outside in the state, but illegal on the reservation, that could flag them as somebody we can't work with. So it was great with this is we partnered with the park, and the volunteers are volunteers of the park then. And so we don't have to deal with that side of the challenges of, permitting or permissions. So we're working with all of our resources to make this as effective as possible. And in this way, working with the park has been really helpful.
Thank you. I'll have one more question. Maybe we can, what's 11:05, but one more question. It's interesting that you can't use machines because they'd harm archaeological artifacts and wouldn't be appropriate. Are the artifacts deep enough that the picks, etc., don't harm anything? Or have you had to craft methods around artifacts as well, even with volunteer efforts?
I think one of the challenges of the machinery is that you can cause a lot of damage real quickly, right? And without seeing what's happening, right? You run a backhoe through something, you just scoop out a huge area, and all of that has just been crushed. Whereas and the operator isn't seeing everything as they go. But when you're operating with a pick by hand and you're scooping things out, and I should say one of our permit conditions is that we have an archaeologist on site during all of our work. You could holler out if you're working a pick and you say, this looks weird, right? This is not something I expected to see, and they could come investigate it. But if you were using heavy machinery, it's possible you could damage something beyond what you could do without having that more immediate feedback of eyes on it quickly.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. And yes, thank you.